Welcome to episode 6, Competitive Advantage. My name is Specco, and Hari, welcome to the Value Investor TV podcast. This is our 6th episode. Welcome, everybody. Before we jump into today's topic, competitive advantage, I want to remind you what we covered in the last episode. Last 2 to 3 episodes, we talked about, investing is a good place. Investing is something that you have to do if you want to retire. And there are different places to do it, different philosophy. We talked about value investing philosophy, why we think it's a good strategy. We also talked about why companies are the best place to look to put your money behind. And we also talked about, we talked about those, and then we talked about what is the purpose of the company? What is the purpose of business? And lastly, in our very last episode, we talked about, how do you start a company? The first thing you have to do is finance it. There are 2 different ways to finance it, roughly speaking, equity and debt. We talked about those things in the last 5 episodes. Today, we want to dig a bit more into companies and start analyzing them. And we want to go back to the example that we brought up in the last episode, which is the hot dog stand. And the reason why we brought up the hot dog stand is to get us, and you included, the listeners, to think about investing as if you're owning the entire company, as if you're the owner of the company. So let's start with that. So when you are starting your hot dog stand, the first thing that comes to my mind and to most people's mind is, how can I do better than the competition? Right? There are so many hot dog stands, and let's say you're starting in New York City. So many hot dog stands in New York City. Why is my hot dog stand better than theirs? Why should customer come to me? So those type of questions come to the heart of this matter, which is competitive advantage. Why is my hot dog stand better than everyone else? And why should I win business? Right? And so this is a very important concept as we move forward in analyzing companies, because we'll talk about that later. We'll talk about why competitive advantage is so important. I want to get Hari's take on competitive advantage. Hari?
Yeah. So, I think the way that, to start here, we should just, what is a competitive advantage, or what does that mean really? And I think you can probably guess just from the words there, but, from the standpoint of a business itself has, that has a competitive advantage, is able to sustain itself in downturns and so on. It gets to the heart of the matter is, why is my business going to be able to effectively charge or make more money than some other business, right? Because at the end of the day, as we talked about in previous episodes, businesses exist to make the owners profit, right? Mm-hmm. And if the owners aren't getting, they want to maximize that profit. And the best way to do that is to have some advantage over your competition. Mm-hmm. And there are definitely different ways to have an advantage over your competition, but in investing speak, Warren Buffett kind of coined this term, a moat, right? Mm-hmm. And if you think about a castle has is your business's fortress, and there are always barbarians trying to get into that fortress. So what prevents them from getting in? Well, that's a moat. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, a moat that has a wider moat with a deeper moat is more impenetrable than, say, a castle that is, has no moat, right? Or has a very narrow moat, right? It's easier to break in. So, capitalism, the whole point of capitalism is to, is competition, right? It allows the customer to get a better value by having more competition. So, think about this, when landlines came out in, the price per phone call was outrageous. And then as more, and then when, and it was a monopoly. So yeah. AT&T could charge whatever they want at the time. So then as they started getting, deregulating this, there became more competition. The price started to come down. So the value became better for the customer. Well, when the value gets better for the customer, somebody has to pay for it. And that's usually the business, right? So competition is what is going to erode your business. What do you do to protect against that erosion from other things? there are businesses out there, you know, the restaurant industry is notoriously brutal, right? And we're talking about hot dogs right now, but we'll be talking about other businesses in the future. You know, so if you have a great concept, right? Like think about, you know, burrito places or, you know, that opened up. Chipotle started, but Chipotle wasn't actually the first one that did it. You know, in Texas, we had some other ones, Mission Burrito and Freebirds. And, you know, Chipotle came in, at least in Houston, a little bit later. You know, and so after that happened, you know, Freebirds, you know, lines started shrinking and you know, and that kind of thing. So restaurants are hot when they first open up. And then they, you know, the business kind of tails off. So how do you keep, you know, people coming back to your restaurant? How do you, because I mean, it's very easy for you to drive past a restaurant to go to the next one. Mm-hmm. So people are constantly chasing the new thing. So how do you keep people coming back to your restaurant so you can sustain that profit?
Right. Yeah. So competitive advantage, in other words, you know, it's like Warren Buffett, like you said, Warren Buffett quoted the moat, right? So you want to be able to protect your business from competition eroding away your profitability.
Yeah.
And the better you're able to do that, the more sustainable your business is going to be.
Yeah.
I think Warren Buffett a lot of times uses the word sustainable, some edge, some sustainable, like a secret weapon, like a secret sauce that no one can copy, or some sort of edge that you can protect yourself against. It's just like moat. You know, I think moat analogy, I think it's quite appropriate. So that's competitive advantage. So when we think about competitive advantage, right, you think about, you know, you can think about different types of competitive advantage, right? We talked about in terms of food business, a competitive advantage you might think could be a brand, right? People walking into Starbucks, you know, there's a Starbucks brand versus some other Joe's Coffee. You might be more inclined to go to Starbucks because you know the quality of the business. There's a brand attached to it. And if you think about some other business, there might be other type of competitive advantage. So maybe another thing would be price. If there's Starbucks coffee and Starbucks coffee, some other coffee that has some similar type of quality of brand, you might be more inclined to buy coffee from a place that is charging you less money. So there's different types of competitive advantage, and so we want to touch on that. So let's start with monopoly. Monopoly is a type of competitive advantage. Tell us more about that, Hari.
Well, I mean, there's, you know, obviously the word monopoly has a negative connotation, but, you know, back in the old days, there was, you know, the Standard Oil and, you know, the railroad industries had competitive advantages through a monopoly where they basically own the market, right? I mean, oil is a commodity, right? You know, you can't charge, you know, more oil, you know, for a barrel of oil because you're Exxon, right? Mm-hmm. It's just the price of oil is the price of oil. Mm-hmm. But if you have a monopoly, then you have the ability to control that. Now, there are natural monopolies that exist that are, you know, something that you just can't, you know, it just has to be that way. So if you think about it from the perspective of like a cable company, you know, the cable company, in a lot of places, they have to run wires to the houses, and they have to get that permit to do that from the city, you know, to do so. So, you know, they're running this wire over your telephone line. You know, the cable company or the city doesn't want 50 cable companies running wires over that. But then, you know, so that's the moat there. But then there is also a thing like in with energy here in Texas. The way it works is the wire is actually owned by a different company, and any provider can provide the electricity, you know, to the grid. So the grid isn't owned by the power companies. So that is how you could lose that moat very quickly. Is that they deregulate that market, change the law, and then suddenly your moat just disappears overnight, right? And so these are things that you have to think. It's not just the moat itself, but it's the counterpoint to the moat, right? How do I lose that moat? Because that's how your business loses profit, right? Very, very quickly. And sometimes that can happen overnight, you know, so regulation can change the way, you know, businesses operate.
Exactly.
Think about like in healthcare, you know, one procedure for, you know, in a doctor's office may be very profitable. And then the next day, Medicare changes the rules and it's no longer profitable. So then that procedure just doesn't happen as much, right? So, that is one way of thinking about these monopolies, is that there is a certain way to have it, but what prevents you from keeping that monopoly, alive, right? And sometimes that's not as rigid or strong as you think it is.
Right. Yeah, monopoly is certainly a competitive advantage that you have to think about. And to Hari's point, you have to think about the counterpoint of, okay, you have this monopoly, but what could destroy this monopoly?
Yeah.
As an investor, you have to think about that. If you're looking at a company that's playing in this space with monopoly as their competitive advantage, you got to think about the counterpoint to just touch on Hari's point there. Okay, the second competitive advantage we want to cover is high switching cost. It's sometimes called stickiness. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, so, think about a service that you use where switching to a different service that competes with that is just a pain in the butt, right? And so where you see a lot of that is, think about like your software that you use like online, like your TurboTax or Quicken, QuickBooks, that kind of stuff. So, for a long time, these services were used by accountants. They're very familiar with it. For them to switch, it's not necessarily that they couldn't switch. It's just it's difficult to switch, and the other competitor may not have certain features. So, for example, in the TurboTax realm, the QuickBooks realm, this is all owned by Intuit, by the way. The switching is to you put in all your bank information, it downloads all of the transactions directly into TurboTax. So for you to switch, some of the competitors don't have that ability, that feature. So, that's one reason you would stay. And as I've heard from several people, that run small businesses and use this software, you just can't switch over because it just comparable features don't, exist. And that's not your primary focus if you're running a small business, right? We're running our hot dog stand. I don't want to spend 80 hours a week focused on my accounting software, right? And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time learning it, and then once I learn it, I stick with it, right? Think about Adobe Photoshop, right? Are there competitors out there? There's actually competitors that are completely free.
Yeah, open source
software that competes with it, but you don't see everybody's shifting over to open source software for that. And, there are some people who certainly have, and, but the industry standards remains Photoshop. And a lot of that is because there's a competitive advantage, or, because it's sticky, right? People like learning it. And once they learn it, if you're a professional, you don't want to spend all your day learning new pieces of software unless it really radically improves your workflow. And so even if something is marginally better here or there, you're going to just stick with what you have, because it's just easier to work with.
Exactly. One of the things that I've encountered, when I was in college, Chase, which is pretty dominant in the Texas market, Chase would come to universities and offer, basically free $300 to open a bank account with Chase. And ever since then, I stuck with it because it's so sticky. I don't want to get out of it. It's just hassle to move all of my money, all of my banking account.
Yeah.
So that's a strategy that the companies use to get you to stick.
Right.
And then the stickiness grabs onto you for a long, long time.
Yep.
Okay, so that is high switching costs as a competitive advantage that we just talked about. The next is what's widely known as network effect. This has been brought up in many times because of the rise of social media, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. Tell us about that, Hari.
Yeah, so think about, in 2011, 2012, there's this service called Google Plus that came out. And so Google Plus was, supposed to be a competitor. It may have even been earlier, like 2010. That was a competitor to Facebook. And it had some features that were more privacy focused, that you could limit your circle of friends and things like that. Google had all the money in the world to try and promote this service. And Facebook was this dominant player already. And, Google Plus is still around, but it is not, the dominant force that Facebook is. And simply for the fact is the reason that people go on to Facebook is their friends are on Facebook, right? And so there's a network of people already there. And so people go there because there are other people on it, right? This started largely when the internet kind of grew up, with, people kind of associated this with eBay, right? Why did people buy off of eBay? Well, because there was more stuff to buy from eBay. So then they went there. And so Facebook kind of has that where people are on Facebook already. So, competitors have to pull people away from Facebook in order to get competition, onto their own platform. And so is it possible? Sure. And I think one of the things that we're seeing now is that, Facebook has been in the news for the last year or so. Recently,
actually.
Yeah.
Shirley Sandberg is testifying, and Twitter guy as well.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of concern amongst, certain groups of people about privacy and things like that. And there has always been. And so some people have deleted their Facebook accounts. There's a lot of, things about this Cambridge Analytica stuff.
Yep.
So that kind of drives people away. But what we haven't seen really is, in mass people leaving. I mean, in effect, there are some people who left. There's more people who've come on. So at the end of the day, there hasn't been any net, effect. But really what it is that Facebook has, if you think about it, some other service like Snapchat offers a feature that Facebook doesn't have. Well, what ends up happening is Facebook just copies the feature, right?
Exactly.
Whether it's on their Instagram platform or their own platform.
Yep.
So, the network effect is their only competitive advantage. That is what's protecting their users from, staying on their platform.
Yep.
And so then Snapchat doesn't have that large user base, so they can steal, features from them without consequence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we talked about this, Facebook and some other, social media platforms and companies that use network effect as their competitive advantage. Like you said, Facebook's core competitive advantage is network effect, not technology, not any of these things that that people tend to push. It's really the core of it gets to the network effect.
Yeah.
And that's why they're able to sustain their business. So that's the network effect. And the fourth competitive advantage we want to cover is lowest cost provider. Sometimes just providing the cheapest good and services can be a competitive advantage. Can you tell us about that, Hari?
So this is my favorite competitive advantage for a lot of reasons.
Shoe, for instance.
Yeah.
By the way, Hari's a big fan of Skechers, and he owns Skechers stocks, and he wears a lot of Skechers.
Yeah, we won't talk about that one today, but we will. I will probably mention it in the future. But I think the classic example is probably Walmart, right? So,
yep.
That one's probably the easiest to understand.
Yep.
In terms of a lot of, low cost provider is basically the person who can provide a good or service cheaper than anyone else, right? So if you think about that, think about I'm trying to make the most money, right, in this market. And in a very competitive market, price really, if I'm selling a commodity, right, which is whatever, shoes, in the case of Walmart, it's basically everything, right, everything retail. If I can sell it for a little bit cheaper than my competitor, then people come to my store, right? And if I can sell a lot of goods, then people come to my store because it's just a one-stop shop, right? So what ends up happening is, you get this, because Walmart is so huge, they have the ability to buy in, enormous bulk, right? And then they provide those savings onto their customers by providing it cheaper than anybody else can. And so what ends up happening is it is a very powerful moat because they are so much cheaper than everybody else that their ability to squeeze people out, right? And we've seen this, and people complained from the 60s on, Walmart has crushed all these small, small businesses and so forth. Well, Walmart has crushed those small businesses to the value of, to the benefit of the consumer, right? I'm paying less for the same good than I am. I mean, who wants to pay full price for anything, right? I mean, after all, we're all value investors. That's essentially what, what value investing is,
bargain hunting.
Yeah. It's dumpster diving, really. Right. And I mean, who doesn't love more, dumpster diving than at Walmart, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can buy things for cheap, right? And so the idea here is that the lowest cost provider is able to sustain downturns better than anybody else because they can absorb that cost reduction without impact to their business, as opposed to the high cost provider. And I think the other thing that, and this is an aside to the moat concept, is that the low cost provider tends to be the business that has the most focus on, the best run business, right? If they're the low cost provider, they really focus on providing that at a razor thin margin. Then that means that they know exactly how their business is run successfully. And
that's a really interesting point, actually. I'd never really thought about that as a kind of a tangent to low cost provider, because like you said, if you want to provide something at a thin margin, you need to understand exactly how this price point is, how you're able to sustain this price point from all the way from sourcing to logistics to retailing, everything.
Yep.
So that's a very interesting point you bring up there. Yeah. So low cost provider is our fourth competitive advantage. Let's move on to our fifth. Strong brand. We talked about it early on. We talked about it, Starbucks being one of the companies that benefit from their strong brand. Tell us about that. Strong brand.
So I'm not a coffee drinker, so I'm not going to bring up Starbucks, but my favorite example is actually Disney, right? So if you think about it, the Disney brand carries with it 70 years of quality, right? Yeah. If you have children, you basically can't escape the Disney tax, right?
Which you couldn't have.
You
went.
I've gone to Disney World, 3 times, and I own all the movies and all that stuff.
You're happy to do it, by the way.
Yeah, and I have no problem paying for it because, the thing is that as a kid, I watched all those movies. It's fun to watch it as an adult with my children. And the brand itself, in your own mind, it carries these warm fuzzies, right? Like you think about Disney, you're like, hey, this is, I really like that, right? And, they have the history of animation. They have the history of the theme parks. They have all of this, toys, things like that come with it. And, think about, as, a lot of people think childhood is like their favorite, their favorite part of their life, right? That time between, 4 and like 10 years old is, when they really have, you remember fondly as as an adult is your childhood. Well, and what does Disney cater to? Your childhood, right? So that brand itself carries so much weight with it, right? And, Walt Disney, I think, was one of the best businessmen, in the history of the world. Yeah. And, his childhood was very heavily influenced by his time when he lived in a small town called Marceline, Missouri. And it was actually he was there like when he was like 4 till about 10 years old. So that same time frame is what he focused his entire life on, was making products, for him, it wasn't about the profit, right? He never thought about it from a profit standpoint, but he always made a lot of money. And it was because his focus was on the quality of the product and maintaining that, the Disney brand image. I mean, their customer service is fantastic. You can't really go there and not feel good about it, right? Yeah. And so, that brand is so powerful. And now brand reputation is something that can be quickly evaporated, overnight. If we find out that, a company that we love is doing something, horrendous or,
some scandal,
some scandal can quickly change that. Right. But, it's a reputation is something that's built over a lifetime and lost in a second, right? So you always have to be careful about brands. But, typically brands have can be a very strong moat in many cases.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, so that's the strong brand competitive advantage that Hari just talked about, with a great example of Disney. Disney is a great brand. Okay, let's move on to the next competitive advantage, which is regulation. Regulation. In fact, we are in a regulated space. Hari and I work at a healthcare startup. Healthcare is a highly regulated space. So tell us about regulation as a competitive advantage.
Yeah, so if you have to go and get regulated, by a government institution, whether that's the FDA, the FAA, or some other, organization, it typically means that, you get you get some protection because you have to do some level of work to get there, right? And so that kind of limits the lazy people from, going after what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
That's part of this, right? There are some that are more complex, like patents allow you to get like a 17-year exclusive license to, and it may be less in some cases, but for drugs it's up to 17 years to be able to sell that particular chemical formula, and you have to spend a lot of money up front to prove to the FDA that this this chemical is valuable. And so once you have that in place, you are able to sell for a long period of time. Now, there are other types of regulatory, things that are maybe a little less thing. I mean, think about Boeing or Lockheed Martin.
Yep.
They have these contracts with the government for, providing planes and so forth. You just can't, you and I can't just start a plane manufacturing company today. Now you say, well, that's startup capital and all these other things, but there's also a regulatory component to it that they have to, pass in order to meet that. And, that's a very, very strong moat because, if the government is going to put out a bid for a certain contract, you have to meet certain criteria, and those criteria allow you to limit your competition, right? Lockheed knows exactly what the criteria are, so they skate towards where the puck is going to be in this case.
Yeah, Lockheed Martin and some other defense contractor, they spent a lot of money lobbying, and that's part of the expense that they have to put into place to get that regulation. And also, I want to point out that regulation, if you're looking into multinational companies, you have to look at regulations in different countries and different jurisdictions.
Yep.
And so you can have a regulation in one place, regulation moat, regulation competitive advantage in one place, but you might not in other countries.
Right.
So something to consider there. Let's move on to our seventh competitive advantage, which is related to regulation, is intellectual property. Hari mentioned drug patents. So this is kind of a tangent to regulation, but more specific to IP. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so intellectual property could be something like a patent or a copyright, where you have the ability to think about a music business that, or in the case of Disney, they have a copyright and a trademark on Mickey Mouse and that's that kind of thing. It could be a patent for a drug or a medical device kind of thing, but there's also so the intellectual property is kind of a very large thing, but the other thing that you can think about is sometimes it's just a trade secret, right? And that trade secret is think about WD-40, right? So this is a lubricant that costs a lot of money to reproduce. Nobody else has really kind of reproduced it. There's no patent on WD-40. It is a trade secret. The guy who developed it took 39 tries, and then on the 40th he found a lubricant that really worked. And rather than patenting it, he just didn't release the formula so that nobody could actually replicate this. Right. And so if you look at the formula for Coca-Cola, it's the same thing, right? It's heavily guarded in a vault in, Atlanta, Georgia. It doesn't have any, could I go and find all the ingredients and mix it myself? Yeah. But in the case of Coca-Cola, it's not really the formula that's what's making it valuable. It's the brand.
It's the brand, yeah.
And the other things that go with it.
Right.
So,
but to your point about, intellectual property being, you got trade secret, copyright, you have trade secrets, different types of intellectual properties you can define your competitive advantage around.
Right.
And so the difference that Hari was mentioning was, okay, patents, you have to file with the regulatory body. It may be different regulatory body in one company and another, but trade secrets, you don't really file anything. It's just you store it away, because with patents, when you file it, you're basically saying, okay, here's what I did. These are the steps that you took to get to Coca-Cola, or these are the steps you took to get to some invention. and you're disclosing that to the entire world and saying, okay, we want a patent on this. Whereas trade secret, you're not really disclosing any of that and saying, okay, we're not going to disclose any of this, but at the same time, we're not going to get the protection that is provided by the regulatory agency.
Yep.
So just wanted to clarify that. So that's intellectual property as a competitive advantage. Competitive advantage in our list, number 7. Let's move on to number 8, competitive advantage, high cost infrastructure. This is an interesting one. I think this is an interesting one in the sense that it applies to very large industries.
Yeah.
Tell us about high cost infrastructure competitive advantage.
So, I mean, if you look at your electric utility, they have to spend a lot of money up front to build a power plant, to build the, the wiring to, connect you, your house basically all the way to the grid and then to the, to the power plant. So that, is a multi-million-dollar, sometimes billion-dollar investment. And so providing that service is, something that requires a lot of capital, requires a lot of, so, two people who are just saying, hey, I'm going to disrupt the utility business.
Oil and gas.
Yeah. It's just not going to happen, right? I mean, you have to raise money to do that, right? And so a lot of people talk about that. I think you see this also with some of the older industries, like railroad. Yeah. Railroads are one of the classic examples of, a business that requires a ton of investment, right? In order to maintain to put rails down, run that, you have to get permits from and approvals from the owners of the land. You have to get all of this. Yeah. And it requires government intervention. It requires a lot of other things. So you get this all set up. Once you have that infrastructure in place, you are the only person who can put, railroad cars on that track. Yeah. Now you can allow other people on and just charge them a fee, or you can run your own rail, on top of that. You've already done the work to put, to lay down the track. So you may as well, run the cars in between the two places. But it's very, it can be very profitable once that is in place. Mm-hmm. So, high cost infrastructure is great, especially if it's a legacy thing that you just continue to maintain, right? If you don't have to actually put it into place, it's fantastic. And, mm-hmm. This is one of the things that could be very profitable, very lucrative for a business. But today, starting those businesses, this is what keeps competition away, is that they just don't have the money to compete with you.
Exactly. How are, like you said, how are we going to raise billions and billions of dollars to lay down a track? There's no way we're going to do that. And that's a moat. Yeah.
And I think if you think about it this way, like, let's say I gave you $100 billion today, and I want you to go beat Amazon at retail. You think you could do it?
No, probably not.
No. And it's not because it's not an issue of money, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I could give you all the money in the world. You're not going to go beat Walmart at what Walmart does, mm-hmm. right? I mean, maybe you can compete, right? But I mean, they have all of this history, mm-hmm. right? And that history is invested into their stores and their infrastructure and all of this stuff. So you can try, but it's going to be really hard to beat them.
Very difficult. Very, very difficult. Yeah. So that's a high cost infrastructure competitive advantage. So let's kind of wrap it up and kind of summarize this competitive advantage. We talked about 8 different competitive advantage. I just want to touch on them really quickly. 1, monopoly. 2, high switching cost, also known as stickiness. Number 3, network effect. We talked about Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. 4th, lowest cost provider. Great example, Walmart. 5th, strong brand. Great example of that would be Disney. Number 6, regulation. 7, intellectual property, and 8, high cost infrastructure. So those are the competitive advantage that we talked about. But I do want to mention this. A business can have multiple competitive advantage. You can have multiple moats. A company could have, let's say, a brand moat and an intellectual property moat, or this company could have network effect and a brand, such as Facebook. You could have, Facebook has a brand. But it also has network effect as its competitive advantage. So companies could have multiple. You want to mention something about that, Harry, really quick?
Yeah, I mean, I think just you can have multiple moats. Moats can also change, right? Mm-hmm. They're dynamic. So, just like companies are dynamic, and we talked about that earlier, in an earlier episode, moats can change over time, and you can see this with, a company like Sears, right? For a long time, they were the retailer, and then Walmart and other companies came around and slowly ate away at their business. And now they're a shell of their former self. So, they change over time, they disappear. So you have to be constantly on your guard, constantly learning about how the industry is changing, whether it's retail or oil and gas or whatever you're looking at, whatever company you're looking at, or in our case, hot dogs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think the other thing is competitive advantage is a very complex concept. It's not something that you're going to listen to a 30-minute podcast and then just understand. We're going to talk about this a lot over the next however many episodes we do. Yeah. And I think it's really important to kind of learn this and just kind of, let it sit in your mind for a little while. And then we revisit this concept again and again. You'll start to understand it better, over time.
Absolutely. So why don't we do a quick exercise? We talked about hot dog stand as an example, as if we're starting a business. So now that we've covered competitive advantages, 8 of them, let's do an exercise and do a mental exercise of, okay, when you're starting a hot dog stand, what could be your competitive advantage? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, and so it's going to be tough, right?
I think, tough.
When you start any business in the restaurant industry, you could have a special recipe, you could have some, literal secret sauce, right? And that could be what allows you to attract people. In some cases, it's like you have a celebrity owner who is, able to promote it through some other means, other than his or her own, restaurant or name, and that allows them to attract a following. But that's not always, sustainable either, right? Celebrities, disappear over time as they, if you're a basketball, star, when you stop playing basketball, you may not be as well remembered as, when you were playing. So that can help, that hurts you. Mm-hmm. So really, when we're starting this hot dog business, what is our advantage? I mean, hot dogs itself are a fairly cheap, item. So being a low-cost provider in that space may not really save me a lot of money.
Right. Yeah, $1 hot dog versus 90 cents hot dog.
Yeah.
It's one and the same.
Right. And some people may not want a cheaper hot dog, right? Yeah. I mean, let's be honest, hot dogs are just basically, whatever's left over, right? So, if I'm making a hot dog, I don't necessarily want the cheapest hot dog, right?
Yeah.
But so you can't have a monopoly, right? Yeah. On the hot dog business. Right. I certainly can't own all of the hot dogs, right? Mm-hmm. And even if I did, I don't know that I could necessarily, I may be able to charge a premium, but not really, right? There's, my hot dog store has no competitive advantage over another hot dog store. So you can go in between these two without really any expense, right? Mm-hmm. So there's no switching costs.
Yeah.
There's no network effects because you don't come to my hot dog store because other people are eating at my hot dog store, right? Mm-hmm. And we talked about low-cost provider.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's possible that we could build a brand around, the hot dog itself, the hot dog brand that we create, and it stands for quality and it stands for, high, taste and things like that. So that's kind of where I feel like the only competitive advantage we could have. But if you're starting out, you don't really have a brand, right? And so that's where a celebrity owner could help you, help you out. But I don't feel like there's a brand to start with. That's something that you build over time, and it can create a reputation, for that brand.
Exactly. Yeah, and then a few more things. Regulation, right? You could have in the city of New York or in Houston, you might have to get a license from the city officials to get it. That could be a regulation. But then, you have all these other competitors who already have those regulations.
Right.
So it's not really a moat when everyone else has what you have.
Yeah, I mean, they have to just compete on a level playing field, which means they have to get the same regulated things that I have to get. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, so that's a quick exercise through a hot dog stand. And what we just did right there is what you have to do when you are analyzing any company in the stock market. You have to go through this exercise. Okay, Apple. Let's look at Apple. What is the competitive advantage? A, B, C. What isn't their competitive advantage? A, B, C. So you got to go through this mental exercise every single time when you are analyzing a company.
And not only that exercise, but what will breach their moat,
Yeah.
right? How do the barbarians get into the castle and take all the goodies, right?
Yeah.
And the way that they do that is, they have to breach your moat. And so you have to think, 2 steps ahead of them and say, hey, if this business has a moat, but it's eroding, right? Or it's getting smaller every day, maybe I need to, step back, or maybe my margin of safety has to be much larger, before I would invest. So these are all factors in your investment process that you have to start going through.
Yeah. Great. So today's topic, competitive advantage. It was quite a long podcast. It's pushing 40 minutes now. Thank you all for listening. Let's just quickly recap what we talked about today. We talked about what is competitive advantage. We talked about the idea of moat, and then we kind of summarized different types of competitive advantage, starting from monopoly all the way to high cost infrastructure, 1 through 8. And we talked about, we went through this exercise of a hot dog stand and trying to figure out if we could have a competitive advantage when we're starting this business. And we talked about we can have multiple moats and the importance of thinking about how that moat could be breached as an investment process. Very, very critical investment process. So that is it for us today, episode 6. Thank you all for listening. And if you like this episode, please go ahead and subscribe to our channel, be it YouTube or be it on the podcast app that you're listening to. Please do that. We're just starting out, so any help that we can get will help us. And leave a comment if you want to. If you want to, chat with us, we'll be happy to respond to your comments. So, thank you all. We'll see you on the next episode.